I remember years ago, after one of our readings in the chapel on campus at Mount Meigs, one of the parents came up to me and she said, when I've talked to my son on the phone or whenever I've visited him here, all he wants to talk about is the writing class and the writing that he's doing. And she looked at me and she paused and she said, I feel like I almost have my son back. And I've never forgotten that moment.
Marlin Barton received an MFA in creative writing from Wichita State University and is the first recipient of the Capote Prize for short fiction. He teaches in the low-residency MFA program at Converse University in Spartanburg, South Carolina. He also teaches creative writing in a program for juvenile offenders called Writing Our Stories, created by the Alabama Writers Forum. Bart was a panelist at the Deep South Convening, which is where I met him. When did you graduate with your MFA, and how do things differ from what you see in the program you teach in now?
Well, I got a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Wichita State University in 1990. And it differs from the program that I teach in now, which is at Converse University. I've been doing that since 2010, I guess. There are a couple of differences. One is when I was in grad school at Wichita State, it was a full program. It took at least 3 years to complete it. It was 24, no, excuse me, it was 48 hours of classwork. And so I took as many academic literature classes as I did creative writing classes. And I also taught freshman English as a graduate teaching assistant while I was there to pay my way through grad school. So in the program where I teach now, it's a low residency program, which means the students come to campus for two residencies per year that last about 10 days. And those residencies are real intensive. I mean, we work from morning to night with workshops and lectures and craft talks. We cram in a lot. And so then the students will send me their work, or they'll send their mentor work during the course of the semester, and we respond to it in great detail. I type up very detailed responses to their stories or novel chapters. And that's something that I didn't get in my program because my professors would have just read the story that I had turned in for workshop probably the day before or maybe the morning of. So it would be fresh in their mind. And they did a great job, but I kind of wish that I had had written detailed responses to my work like I do for my students, because it's really helpful, I'm sure, for those students to kind of come back to those detailed responses time and again as they look at the story or the chapter they're working on. And I'll tell you one other difference. When I was in grad school, everyone was writing literary fiction or literary poems. My students now write in all different genres. Some write literary fiction, some write uh, speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy fiction, and so that's a big difference, and that's really come on in the last maybe 8 years or so. And so I work with students on whatever it is they want to write. I never try to force a student to be a different writer from what they are. So I meet students where they are and let them work on what they want to work on. Uh, Otherwise, I'd be wasting their time and mine.
I'm curious to know who was on the faculty in your MFA program.
Let's see. One of my teachers was James Lee Burke, who had published several novels at that point, but he hadn't had the big success that he had later. As you may know, he writes crime fiction, and he's from South Louisiana, and he has a detective named Dave Robichaux, and he's written I don't know how many Dave Robichaux novels, but they're beautifully written. He's a really poetic writer. He also has another character who he writes about who is a lawyer in Montana. So Jim lives both, well, for a lot of years there after he really became successful, he lived in both South Louisiana and Montana. Now he lives in Montana full time, but he's a great writer. He's been wildly successful with his fiction for years now and was such an inspiring teacher. Uh, as for other people on the faculty, the poet Albert Goldbarth was there. He has a pretty big reputation. He's won, multiple awards. He was a big name in our program. I never took a class from him, but I knew him fairly well and would see him over the years after grad school.
Can you talk a bit about how you first got involved with teaching creative writing to juvenile offenders in Alabama? How did you start that work and what drew you to the space?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting story. I was a member of the Alabama Writers Forum, which had been in existence for a few years, and I had met the executive director a couple of times. Her name is Jeannie Thompson. She's a really fine poet, and she was director of the forum for about 30 years. She retired about 2 years ago. Anyway, I knew Jeannie a little bit, and I had been teaching at Clemson University in South Carolina. I moved back to Montgomery, and I bumped into her downtown one evening, and she said, "I'm trying to start a creative writing class out at the Mount Meigs Juvenile Facility. I'm looking for somebody to teach the class." She said, "Would you be interested?" She'd heard me do a reading a few years before, and for whatever reason, my reading stuck in her mind, and so she thought I might be the right person for this job. And the second she told me about the program and what she had in mind and who I would be teaching, I immediately said yes. I just knew it would have to be a fascinating job. And I knew that those boys would have stories to tell and maybe stories they needed to tell. And I really wanted to be able to help them do that. So I feel really fortunate that this job came my way.
What would you say is the most surprising thing you've learned in this role?
Let's see. I'll tell you one thing I learned real early on. The students that I teach, they take the writing classes at Mount Meigs uh, voluntarily. No one tells them, you have to take the writing class. Not all the students, if all the students out there were forced to take the writing classes, it wouldn't work very well. So all my students, come to me voluntarily, and their abilities are kind of all over the place. All they really have to have is an interest, right? And they can come into the class. But I have some students who have more ability than others. I have some students whose mechanical abilities are not very strong, and I really have to, work with them and give them a lot of help. But early on, I had a student who I think he had a reading disability. I don't know that for certain, but the first time I looked at a rough draft of a poem that he had written, I could not decipher it. Uh, and I said, okay. I said, don't try to read this line that's on your page here. Just tell me what you said. And so he told me what he said, just looking straight at me. And I wrote it down exactly as he said it. And I said, okay, in this next line, what did you say here? And he told me, and I wrote it down. And that way I was able to get a completed draft that I could read and make sense of. And what I discovered is that even though his mechanical skills were not strong, that he may have even had a reading disability, he still had an innate sense of language and metaphor that was just amazing to me. So even though he was limited on the page, his mind was just alive with language. And I remember one of his lines was, I feel so lonely like a worm in concrete. And I thought, wow, that's original. That's a kid who has an instinctive sense of language and metaphor. So after that point, no matter what a student's mechanical abilities were or whatever their mechanical issues were, I knew that they could still write good poems.
So you work with young people in these juvenile facilities. I wonder if you could speak a bit on how working with the young people differs from like the older people in your the low res MFA classes that you teach.
At Converse, yeah. Uh, you know, as important as writing is to the older students I teach at Converse, that these are people who want to achieve success. They want to publish. They want to publish books. I think the students at Mount Meigs, they need writing in an even more visceral way. I think they really feel or have to express themselves. A lot of them have been told they're no good. A lot of them, I think, struggle with depression and a sense of hopelessness. And I think writing about these feelings is therapeutic to some degree. I think it helps them deal with it. And the same can be true for, adults. But I think these students just need it especially. They need they need to hear praise. They need to be able to speak in a way like they feel they're being heard, because so many of them feel they aren't being heard and they're looked down upon. And so I can sit there with them. I can sit beside them at the computer and work on their poems with them, and I can praise a particular line or an image or a simile, and I can just see the pride in their faces and the almost the relief, that somebody's listening to them. And then in the fall, each fall, we publish an anthology of their work, poems and short stories. And they get to read then in front of an audience in the chapel on the campus at Mount Meigs. Mount Meigs is right outside of Montgomery. It's a community where this juvenile facility has been for over 100 years now. So, anyway, they get to read their work and hear applause. And then people come up afterward with copies of the anthology, and they get to sign their anthologies for these people. Uh, and the pride and the that they obviously take in their work is just an amazing thing to see. I think it gives them a sense of self-worth and hope, and it gives them a better sense of who they are.
Could you speak a bit on what a typical writing workshop session looks like inside a juvenile facility? And maybe how do you set the tone and build trust?
Yeah, so typically what I'll do is, all right, so I've often said this, I don't just walk in and say, okay, everybody write a poem now. And I never tell them what to write about. The way the program is set up, and this was largely came from Jeannie Thompson, who established the program and set it up. It's really craft based. So we have writing exercises that focus on the use of simile, the use of image, the use of metaphor, the use of personification. So on any given day, I might walk in with a poem by a famous poet or maybe not so famous that uses personification or uses metaphor. And so we'll first read through the poem, talk about what it says to us as far as what we feel like it means, what it, how it speaks to human nature, and then we'll begin to look at how it's written, how it's put together. And so then I'll say to the students, okay, let's write something similar. And especially early on in the early part of the year, we'll do group poems together. Well, I'll get the whiteboard out and I'll just say, all right, well, let's start writing something like what we just read. And students will call out lines to me, and I'll just write them down on the board the way they say them. And so they get to see kind of how a poem is, you might say, put together. I remember one time very early on, we were doing an exercise with simile where the students were describing the parts of someone's face. And I remember this one kid said, let's see, he said, my hair is like ebony cloth spun from a midnight sky. And I just thought, wow, that's good. So I wrote that on the board, and of course, I praised the simile. So we write a group poem together, and they see how a poem can begin to be built. And then I say, okay, now everybody, you work on your own poem, and you can write about, whatever you want to. And so they write rough drafts. And then when they complete their drafts, I have them read them out loud. And we sit around a big table in the library, which is a really pleasant place on campus, one of the nicest rooms in the school, and the boys feel real comfortable there. So they'll read their work out loud, and I'll praise what I hear, and the other students will praise it also. And then they'll type their drafts, and that's my favorite part of what I do is sitting down next to each one of my students and working on these drafts. And I think that's where I really begin to build trust with them. When I'm sitting beside them, they know that they have my undivided attention, and they know that I'm trying to make their poems as strong as they can possibly make them. And so we correct little things, but then we'll also strengthen images and shape the poem. And they really begin to learn. Sometimes it's like a light bulb goes off in their head when I'm working with them. I can see it in their eyes. They kind of light up a little bit. Um, so so then we'll finalize the poem and save it, and that's how we work. And sometimes it can take several classes to get all of this done, but that's the process.
That sounds so lovely. How do you navigate the tension between creative freedom and the institutional constraints of the justice system?
That's a good question, and the nice thing is it's not that much of an issue. When I put the anthology together, I do have to have someone on the staff or actually in the administration at the juvenile facility uh, read through the manuscript. Essentially, they are the publisher. The nice thing about the way the program works, it's really a partnership between the Alabama Writers Forum and the Alabama Department of Youth Services, which oversees the housing of juvenile offenders. And so they provide all of the funding for this particular program that the forum does. There are other programs that the forum has, but DYS funds this one. And so they provide enough money for us to have a really nice looking anthology, well printed, really nice cover, something the kids can be really proud of. So someone from the administration will read through the book. Occasionally, there'll be a poem or two that they'll question. And sometimes I can work with them and I can go in and edit a line a little bit in a way that satisfies them. What they're on the lookout for are any lines that are somehow suggestive of gang affiliation. And they know better how to spot that than I do. Also, they're looking out for any line or poem that seems like maybe it doesn't just examine violence, but maybe sounds like it celebrates it. and they don't want to include that in one of the anthologies. And so occasionally they'll ask me to cut a poem, but there will be plenty of other work by the students that by that particular student that I can include. Usually I can work with them and maybe just edit a particular line in some way that they're happy with. But let me stress here, the Alabama Department of Youth Services loves this program. Not only are we in the Mount Meigs facility, we're also in a facility in Birmingham called VACA. A poet there by the name of Salam Green teaches the classes there, and she produces, her own anthology. I'm in my 28th year at Mount Meigs. I think the program there has been in existence for, I think, 26 years. And so DYS loves this program. They are completely supportive of what we do. And they know that the work the students do is therapeutic. It gives them something to, take pride in. So they love this program.
What do you think universities and MFA programs could learn from these sorts of programs?
Hmm. I guess really the only thing that comes to mind is it would teaching in a program like this kind of reminds you all over again that literature and writing can reach everywhere and speak to people who need to hear it, and it gives the people who hear this, who are interested, the ability to write for themselves and to express who they are. Like I said earlier, the students at Mount Meigs, I think, need this writing that they do in a visceral way. And I think it's good to be reminded at whatever level you teach that literature is so powerful that it can reach into a place where you would not expect to find it, maybe. And it can work on a person's feeling of self-worth and abilities. Um, and the other thing I would say would be, if somebody's looking at pursuing a career in creative writing and writing their own books, but needs to make a living, doing this kind of teaching uh, is a real avenue to explore. I would encourage anyone who wants to create a job for themselves. A needed job would be to, speak to someone at a juvenile facility about creating a class like this.
Let's talk about your book, Children of Dust. And I'm going to combine these two questions together. For listeners who haven't read it yet, how would you describe the story and its core themes? And how do those ideas resonate with the young people you work with?
Uh, well, let's see. Children of Dust is a novel set in the 1880s in rural Alabama. And as far as the storyline goes, it begins with one of the main characters whose name is Melinda, delivering a child. And the child only lives a matter of hours and dies under what you might call somewhat questionable circumstances. And what unfolds in the novel is the husband, whose name is Rafe, and who is a formidable character, uh, he suspects that Melinda killed the child. And Melinda suspects that Rafe's mixed race mistress killed the child. And so these questions and conflicts kind of drive the story of the novel. There are chapters set in modern times that focus on two characters who are cousins. One is white, one is black, and they are descendants of the characters that, I write about in the 1870s. And both of these cousins have an interest in their family history, and they're both looking back, trying to make sense of and understand their family history, the way it connects, what it means to them. And so through them, I'm better able to explore questions of race in a modern context. But it also looks at gender because Melinda, she's a woman of the 1880s, married to a very strong, forceful man who he is a representative of the patriarch in that time and place. And she rebels against him in her own ways. There's not really a question of her being able to leave him, but she has certain ways that she rebels against him, particularly when he accuses her of killing her child. So, that's essentially what the novel is about as far as plot line and thematically. And as for my students, I don't know that a lot of them have read the novel. It is available in the library, as are copies of my other books there. And I do occasionally have students read some of my fiction, which I'm always happy to see. Uh, I think I think the novel is partly about generational trauma. And I think my students have experienced that, even if they're not conscious of it, even if they don't know how to articulate that. A lot of my students are from poor families, and, their families have been poor for generations, and they've dealt with issues of drug abuse, alcohol, incarceration. And, my students are at least somewhat aware of their family histories, but they may not think consciously about how all of that has affected them. But I think unconsciously they must have some sense of it. So maybe my students could connect with my novel in that way. I do have to say, I do have to add something kind of funny that happened one time. I wrote a novel a number of years ago called The Cross Garden. One of the main characters has been just been released from a place like Mount Megs. So my teaching there really influenced this novel. So I had a student a number of years ago who came up to me right after we'd started in October. And he said, Mr. Barton, I read that book of yours. He said, I read that Cross Garden. He said, I said, oh, well, thank you. He said, that's the best book I ever read. And this is the best review I'll ever get on anything that I write. So in that novel, this character who's been released, he was in there for breaking and entering. So this boy looks at me and he says, I'm in here for breaking and entering. I said, no, I didn't know that because I'm not a full-time employee at Mount Megs. I don't, I'm not privy to why my students are there, and I really don't want to know. I would rather not know. So I said, no, I didn't know that. He says, yeah, I'm in here for breaking and entering. I said, well, I always wondered if I got it right in the novel. And the kid looks at me and he pauses and he says, oh, you got it right.
Can you talk a bit about your writing process?
Let's see. So I write by hand, which may be unusual at this point, but it's the way I started doing it. And so I write on a yellow legal pad with a blue ink pen. If I didn't have those two things, I don't think I could write fiction. So the way I work, I suppose, is I'll get an idea for a story or a novel, and I'll have some sense of who the characters are, some sense of where the story might go, but I don't work from a detailed outline. I don't really do any outlining. What I will do is before I begin the first chapter or the opening paragraph of a short story, is I'll just write down my thoughts, just by hand. And I might write several pages of notes and ideas with lots of question marks, thinking, do I want to do this or this? And so once I began to get some little bit better sense of things, then I began writing. And, it's been said many times before that writing is an act of discovery. And I think that's true. And I think it's important for somebody writing fiction, especially, to have some sense of discovery as they write. Because if you know exactly what's going to happen next, then your reader is probably going to know exactly what's going to happen next too. And that's not really a good thing. You want the novel to kind of unfold for a reader. And so I guess as I write, my novel unfolds for me. And, I continue taking notes and jotting down thoughts, and some of them I use, some of them I don't. So what I do then is after I finish a draft of a story, I'll type it. And as I type, of course, I'm making changes. I'm editing, I'm doing some rewriting. So I really come out with another draft, which I think is really key in the process. And if it's a novel that I'm working on, which I'm working on one now, when I finish a chapter, then I type it, rewrite as I do that, and then move forward. So it can be a little unnerving. Like this novel I'm 140 something pages in, and I have a sense of where it's going, but I don't know everything. I don't know how some things are going to work out. And that's a little bit scary. I mean, there's a part of you that wants to know, right? Because not knowing creates some anxiety. And that anxiety is maybe not good for us emotionally, but it is good for us as a writer because it keeps us on our toes, it keeps us working hard. And so I just keep pushing along until I finally have, a draft of a story done and typed or a novel. And then always I have some writer friend whose abilities I trust read and critique what I've done before I ever send it out to an editor or a publisher.
What are your best strategies for revision?
Let's see. I'll tell you one thing I've done. Sometimes you get a little stuck about where you're going to go with something or a decision that you've made in the course of a story. And so sometimes I'll stop and I'll think, okay, what choices could a character make in this situation? And then I'll kind of step outside of my character and I'll just think about people in general. And I think, what could someone choose to do in this situation? Or what are the various choices available to them? And I'll make a list, five, six, seven choices. And then I'll pick the one that seems maybe the most unusual, but that still makes sense. And that strategy has helped me a number of times. It particularly helped me in Children of Dust.
That sounds like a really good strategy. Can you give our viewers a writing prompt inspired by your work?
I can. I have often written from old family stories that I've heard growing up from my parents, my grandparents. In fact, Children of Dust draws from a lot of family, well, as I've said before, family history slash legend slash lore, because you don't always know what's completely true in some of those old family stories. But I've written a lot of stories, and at least the one novel I've used those family stories as a springboard. So what I would say to somebody would be to think about some family story you've heard multiple times growing up from parents or grandparents or aunt or uncle, or maybe all of, maybe you heard the story from all of them and heard slightly different versions. See what you can do with this in a fictional sense. Begin with what really happened, but don't feel bound by that. Be open to whatever direction the story might ask to go in. But I have found drawing from old family stories to be a real source of inspiration.
What responsibilities do you feel as a writer and teacher working with vulnerable populations, especially those often left out of mainstream literary conversations?
I think my biggest responsibility to the students I teach at Mount Meigs is to do my best to awaken a sense of language in them. Because in so many of them, it's there. They just need to be able to access it. But maybe what's even more important than that is to let them know that I respect them and that I respect what they write and what they're attempting to do with their writing. I think that respect tells them that they have worth and they should feel some sense of self-worth. That's I think that's what I strive for most of all.
And how do you measure success or impact in this kind of teaching where outcomes might be emotional or invisible?
Kind of in the ways that I talked about a little while ago, I think, when a student is working on a poem and I can help him fine tune the metaphor at work in the poem, and he sees it come more alive in the language of the poem. And I see that light go off in his eyes, and I see that smile on his face. That tells me, well, I was going to say that I'm being successful, but what I really mean here is I think the student is being successful. That's what I'm seeing, and it comes from them. What's important to me is giving them an avenue to express who they are and feel good about themselves.
What advice would you give to writers who want to engage meaningfully outside traditional institutions?
I would just say pursue it. This job that I have teaching juvenile offenders kind of fell into my lap. But you can go to the juvenile detention uh, organization in your state, and you can approach the director, or all juvenile facilities are parts of a school district. They all have their own school district. I mean, you could approach the school superintendent of a juvenile facilities organization. If you go on the website, for your state's facility, you could get a pretty good idea of who you might contact. And so I would simply say, pursue that. It can be a great job and it can be really rewarding.
Looking ahead, what do you hope your legacy is as a teacher, a writer, and someone working at the intersection of art and justice?
Well, that's a big question. I don't think too much about my legacy. I'll still be doing this for a few more years, but as a teacher, well, I tell you what, I think back to when I was a student and I took creative writing classes at the University of Alabama, and then I took, graduate level classes at Wichita State. I can think about certain teachers that were just really instrumental in my growth as a writer. They helped move me along. So I suppose I hope I hope maybe I've helped move some writers along and their growth as writers, both, the teenagers that I teach, because my students are anywhere from 12 to 18, and then the graduate students I teach, who could be anywhere from 22 to 79. So I hope I've helped move people along. As far as my own writing, I hope that I hope I've written deeply enough and honestly enough about human nature, because that's the goal, I think. That that my books and my stories will continue to resonate with readers. And as far as my legacy of teaching juvenile offenders, I hope that the writing they've done with me has helped improve their lives and sent them and helped to send them in the right direction. I remember years ago, after one of our readings in the chapel on campus at Mount Meigs, one of the parents came up to me and she said, "You know, when I've talked to my son on the phone or whenever I've visited him here, all he wants to talk about is the writing class and the writing that he's doing." And she looked at me and she paused and she said, "I feel like I almost have my son back." And I've never forgotten that moment. I don't think she knows what that meant to me. And I've been really fortunate to be part of a program that I think has that kind of power.
I think that's a beautiful ending to this conversation. But was there anything that I didn't bring up that you wanted to talk about?
No, I think your questions were great. I think we've covered most of them. So no, I'm good. I'm good.
Great. It was so nice to meet you and get to know you. Thank you so much for doing this. I feel like I learned so much.
I appreciate it. It's been nice to meet you and really nice talking with you today. You take care.
You as well.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.